welcome everyone to today's webinar on the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and homelessness. My name is Peg Haskalow, and I'm the CEO of Nash, of which the National Alliance for Safe Housing is a project. I'm going to be the moderator today and want to thank you for joining us and welcome to this webinar. I also want to welcome and introduce our presenters. We have a list of very accomplished folks who are knowledgeable about this issue, and I think it's going to be a really great presentation. We have Larisa Kofman, who is the director of Nash. We have Kris Billhardt, who is Nash's technical assistance and training specialist. We also have Suzanne Marcus, Nash's Director of Training and Technical Assistance. We have Linda Olson, the Housing Project Director at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And last but not least, we are joined by Brittany Manzo, the Management and Program Analyst with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. So I would now like to turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Peg. Hi, everyone. This is Larisa. I want to give a brief introduction to the National Alliance for Safe Housing, also known as Nash. We launched in 2015. We're a technical assistance and training provider. We have two amazing project partners, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we're part of the Federal Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium that I'll share a little bit more information about momentarily. Nash provides programs and communities with tools, strategies, and support. We really work at that intersection of domestic and sexual violence and homeless and housing issues. We provide technical assistance on a range of issues, including, but not limited to, coordinated entry, building collaborative partnerships and relationships, trauma-informed practice, rapid rehousing, housing first, flexible funds, as well as federal, state, and local housing protection. Now a little bit more information about the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. So the consortium was also launched in 2015, and the consortium is funded and supported by 3 federal agencies: the Department of Justice, looks like there's a typo, it should be the Office of Violence Against Women, OVW, and OVC, HUD, the SNAP's office under HUD, and the Department of Health and Human Services, DVHTAC. And within the consortium, there are 4 technical assistance providers. We're called the Consortium TA Team. That's the National Alliance for Safe Housing, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and Collaborative Solutions Inc. Moving ahead, as many of you have already participated in several of the webinars that we've recently launched specific to the NOFA in preparation for the NOFA release. This is, I believe, the 4th in the series. We have a couple more webinars coming up. One of them may be of particular interest to those on the call. That one we are planning on doing after the NOFA is released. So there's no date set for it yet. It's called a primer on the NOFA. And yes, we will be diving into the joint component model there. I know many of you have questions around that. There's also another webinar coming up from the National Alliance to End Homelessness that you can register for. If you're interested in registering for more of the webinars or getting more information, I will be sending out webinar links as well as the PowerPoint slides to this presentation and the recordings after the webinar. Something very exciting that we want to introduce is the Safe Housing Partnerships website. This is the first website out there of its kind that really provides resources and information to domestic and sexual violence programs, as well as homeless and housing programs around this specific intersection. You're going to find a wealth of resources from toolkits to white papers to guidance on how to develop partnerships, how to begin to be part of the COC, what a COC is, how to work within a coordinated entry system, what that is, all kinds of good stuff. The website information is also at the bottom of the page that you see. It's safehousingpartnerships.org. You can also request technical assistance from the consortium TA team through the partnership website. Now, a little bit more about this webinar. So we're going to be covering a whole range of areas. It's a very full content webinar. So the learning objectives are understanding the specific barriers survivors face to accessing and maintaining safe housing. We're going to explore a myriad of responses to survivors when it comes to their safe housing needs. We're going to understand the role of the homeless service system and opportunities for partnerships between victim service providers and homeless providers. And we're going to share capacity building tools, trainings, and other resources to all of you. So here's our agenda. We're going to be looking at the intersection. We're going to be going through the barriers to accessing housing. We're going to look at barriers to maintaining housing. We're going to look at the evolving advocacy response, as well as innovative models to safe housing. So here you see that we noted there's going to be an opportunity for question and answer after each section. We're going to modify that a little bit. There's going to be an opportunity for question and answer via the chat box. It's going to be at the end of this presentation, but please do put your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. We are going to be actively responding to them. If we're not able to respond to a question that you have, you're going to have the opportunity to ask for more information. You'll get our contact information at the end of the webinar, but you'll also have the opportunity to directly ask for technical assistance and training from Nash via the evaluation. So do not hesitate to post questions. All right. We want to get a sense of who our audience is. So we have a couple of polls. The first one is, who is our audience? Do you work for a homeless organization, a domestic violence organization, sexual assault organization, or a federal agency? Please go ahead and take a moment. I believe the box to click on is on your screen already, and click on A, B, C, or D.
And just to pop on and help any participants who are having trouble, if you look to your chat box in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, right above it is a feedback box, and that's where the interactive A, B, C, and D answers can be input.
Thanks, Justine. Okay. Wonderful. So it looks like we have a lot of different organizations on this webinar. Wonderful. Okay, good. Great to know the audience. So a couple of more poll questions for you. The next one, is your organization part of the Continuum of Care? Yes or no? If you're not sure or don't know, then you can go ahead and put no answer. Great. Oh, this is great. Okay, so the vast majority of you are part of the Continuum of Care in your community. That's good to know. Thank you. Now, we have our polls done. We want to go ahead and just make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the terminology that we're using today. So I'm not going to read you the definitions, but I want to highlight a couple of things for you. The first is what we mean by safe housing. Safe housing is housing which ensures survivors access to the means to be safe and self-determining. In terms of domestic violence is a pattern of abuse. It also includes emotional abuse, physical, sexual, economic, or psychological. Sexual violence is any type of sexual conduct or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. And Continuum of Care, COC. It's a regional or local planning body that coordinates housing and services funding for homeless families and individuals. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Brittany Manzo with usage. She's going to talk a little bit more about the definition of homelessness that we're using today.
Thanks, Larisa. Thank you. So
The definition of homelessness is different by different federal agency standards, but at its core, homelessness is the extreme end of a continuum of housing instability. Individuals experiencing homelessness are those living in unsheltered locations, emergency shelter and transitional housing, and to an extent, those who are doubled up and or at risk of homelessness. So federal definitions of homelessness differ, but in all federal definitions of homelessness, those fleeing domestic violence are included as considered homeless. So we wanted to make sure that we had that baseline common understanding as we get into our discussion today. Back to you, Larisa.
Wonderful. And now, Kris is going to go ahead and dive into the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and homelessness.
Thanks, Larisa. So let's build our foundation. When we're looking at domestic and sexual violence and homelessness, we can see a definite and very complex entanglement. When we start out looking from the survivor perspective and looking at survivors as a group, we know that housing is just a huge part of what they have to look at and consider when they're trying to make decisions about their lives and the impact of the violence on their lives and on their children's lives. They know that escaping, and we know too, that escaping domestic violence can also mean losing your housing and your footing in the housing world, and also losing income or access to income. There's a huge fear as well, even for survivors who are able to try to stay in their homes because the abuser has left, about whether or not they can sustain that housing without access to the abuser's income and live independently. When we look at sexual assaults, we know that about half of them take place within just a mile of the home of the victim. And you can imagine what kind of lack of safety that creates emotionally and potentially physically for survivors of sexual assault in their own neighborhoods and in the surroundings that they're familiar with, and perhaps even within their own home if the assault has taken place there. The danger of re-encountering their assailant and just the trauma that can be triggered from being in the area where the assault took place is very, very daunting and makes home unsafe. We also know that sexual violence in its aftermath can create severe disruption in survivors' lives and in their ability to, do day-to-day activities such as being able to perform in a job, so that the likelihood of a job loss is high, and it's a big problem for sexual assault survivors. When income is in question, of course, vulnerability to homelessness comes into play as well. And then we know about survivors in domestic violence relationships that they will often stay in those abusive situations to avoid homelessness and poverty that they think might be around the corner if they try to leave without the sufficient supports in place. And this is particularly true when there are children in the household. So when we flip the coin a little bit and look at the homeless population, we can see the intersection coming into play in big ways as well. We know that among those who are chronically homeless, past experience with domestic and sexual violence can be a significant contributor. They may have fled violence, tried to escape the place where an assault took place, and again, without sufficient support or recourse to access safe and stable housing, they become part of the chronically homeless population. Among homeless women, virtually all of them, 92%, have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse in their lives. When we look at family homelessness, we know that domestic violence is a leading cause of the homelessness for women and children in the family homeless population. And we think the figure might be even higher than that because we sometimes don't know when someone enters the homeless or housing system that domestic violence is part of what they're contending with. And for homeless women who are living outside or bouncing around from place to place, the potential for new abuse and assault from a new partner is increased. It's a scary place living out on the streets, and there's often a need for protection. So seeking a new partner is not uncommon in order to have the protection and companionability with someone else. But that relationship can result in becoming the victim of someone else's coercive control. Now I'll turn it over to Britt.
Thanks. So as we explore the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness, it's critical for us to understand the realities facing individuals facing these dynamics, and Kris has started to outline that for us. So I also want to dig in here and assess the realities at the systems level to get an understanding of what systems and programs are and aren't designed to do. That's not to say they can't be improved and expanded from where they are, but first getting a lay of the land will help us explore where there's room for improved connections between these two types of programs. Homeless service systems are designed to offer immediate shelter and connections to supportive services and permanent housing, tailoring those supports to individual or family needs. Local homeless service systems, as we alluded to before, are coordinated by a continuum of care and should ideally serve as a hub for coordinating services and connections to housing for families and individuals experiencing homelessness. So COCs are the mechanism through which HUD provides homeless service funding, but they also implement the systems that allow individuals to connect to housing supports and services. So there are, just for context, for those of you that may not be connected to your COC, there are more than 400 COCs across the country. Some may encompass a whole state, just one city or county, whereas others, often those in rural areas, encompass large parts of a state or two. Texas, for example, has 11 COCs, one of which is considered a balance of state COC, one of those really large ones, and it encompasses 216 counties. So as we think about these intersections and partnerships, the different geographies of different parts of the country will be critical to understanding where partnership opportunities may lie. So as we get into building out our shared understanding of homeless service systems, wanted to offer some background from the federal level. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, known as USICH, leads the federal response to homelessness nationwide, working with 19 federal agencies to coordinate policy around ending homelessness. So federal partners have outlined a vision of a systemic response to homelessness in our federal strategic plan to end homelessness. And that vision is what's here in bold. No one should experience homelessness. No one should be without a safe, stable place to call home. So you are welcome to access the federal strategic plan on our website, usich.gov. But this quote here is really the vision that strategic plan underlines. So there are 5 themes that underpin the strategies to achieve this vision: increasing leadership, collaboration, and civic engagement, increasing access, increasing economic security, improving health and stability, and retooling the homeless crisis response system. These are the themes that support the strategies that will really get us to the point where we can achieve that vision of ending homelessness across the country. So like I said, that plan is available in full at usich.gov. As we get into the dynamics of homeless service systems, you may come to find, as you build partnerships between COCs and domestic violence service providers at the local level, you'll find that there are a few key elements of homeless service programs and systems-wide approaches that are being encouraged by federal partners. They're almost hot topics right now, but they're evidence-based approaches that we're really encouraging communities across the country to adopt. Those include increased collaboration, leveraging mainstream systems, and in the homeless service space, when we refer to mainstream systems, we refer to all of those public supports that are available that aren't specifically directed to individuals experiencing homelessness. Resources like TANF, Social Security and disability benefits, systems that are not exactly about homelessness, but that individuals experiencing homelessness should certainly have access to. So that's a key piece of information that federal partners are trying to share with homeless service systems at the local level. So these are just some of the topics that you'll see coming up quite a bit as you build out those partnerships at the local level. And furthermore, we outlined here just a few different ways that we see to be key points of intersection between the homeless service system and the needs of survivors of domestic violence. So this is almost a list of opportunities that should exist at the local level for homeless service providers and domestic violence service providers to collaborate and share information, share resources, best practices. I'm sure many of you are already partnering on many of these topics, but things like sharing diversion resources. When a family or an individual presents at your doorstep, what resources do you or your community have accessible to ensure that they don't become homeless or have to enter the homeless service system? What best practices and vulnerability assessments exist? How can we align coordinated entry processes? What do we know about connecting mainstream resources and connecting individuals to community-based services and supports that are maybe outside of our own programs, but that we know about? How do we share information across homeless service, mainstream, and domestic violence service providers? So all of these are some ideas to start turnaround as far as where can we find partnership to address the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness. And now, Kris, I'm going to turn it back over to you for more on the intersection.
Okay, so turning back, thanks, Britt. Turning back to the intersection with really an eye to how folks could perceive this affecting services and supports that are going to be needed when you're working with domestic or sexual violence survivors. We know about survivors who can't maintain their housing because they don't get the sufficient support and services to help them retain it. They are really, really vulnerable to being abused, reassaulted, returning to the abuser. There may be a roof there that they can put over their heads, and even though they know the risks that might await them, the risks of remaining vulnerable on the streets or having no place to bring their children often results in them returning to the abuse. We also know that the impacts of domestic and sexual violence very much interfere with being able to access housing and being successful there. And we'll talk about that in terms of housing protections and some of the forms that can take in just a moment. Also, and this is a service implication as well, and support implication, the abuse may not be over when a survivor gets into what she or he hopes is safe housing. Abusers often don't let go easily. They can persist, and they may attempt to sabotage the survivor's success in living independently. Economic abuse is of a huge concern, and the aftermath of it comes with survivors who may enter homeless housing programs or victim services programs. It's a very powerful tool that can be used to control and abuse a survivor of domestic violence in relationship. And this can fall into basically three buckets or three types of economic abuse. Preventing the survivor from being able to acquire resources. This can take the form of not allowing the survivor to hold a job, or if they do have a job, sabotaging their success in that job, getting in the way or forbidding acquiring more work skills or going back to school, messing with the child care so that the survivor has to leave work to go home and take care of the children. So those are some of the forms of preventing resource acquisition. We've also got preventing use of resources, and this may mean keeping information about the family's finances separate from what the survivor gets to see, not having information about their accounts, how much money is in the accounts, not having direct access to that money, sometimes disabling the vehicle so that survivors can't get to the bank or get to a job. So getting in the way of being able to use resources that are typically available in a given household. And then there's exploitation of resources that are connected to economics and financial standing. Generating debt in the survivor's name, sometimes putting the bills or the lease in the survivor's name, and then whatever credit history results from that stays with the survivor. There can sometimes be trade-offs in the abuser's economic preferences, such as not paying the bills so that there's more money for drugs or alcohol or gambling. And there's pretty consistently some issue around damage to a housing unit that might follow a survivor as they come into services. And so these are definite challenges that providers might face when they're working with survivors in trying to help them get effectively housed. Here's another list of the things that really need to become advocacy and support issues. Rather than seeing them as barriers, we really like to see them as points of advocacy. We know that trauma impacts may be considerable for both the survivor and the children in the household. This ranges all the way up to the fact that a survivor may want to come into housing with a pet, because there's lots of fear in leaving the pet behind and subjecting that animal, that dear animal, to whatever abuse that the abuser may perpetrate upon it. There may be chemical dependency issues. There is often, as I was kind of referring to, sabotaged work history, which can certainly sabotage rental history. There's typically a lot of isolation, and there may be legal issues, immigration legal issues, child custody. There could be a criminal case or civil matters that are still in process when the survivor comes into housing. And now, Linda Olson.
Hi, everybody. So we know that there are certainly barriers to accessing housing. And the first one that we all hear and think about is the lack of housing, especially affordable housing. So when we think about the housing stock in our communities and how many people are homeless or on the brink of and trying to hang on to that, it's really difficult for any of us to find housing, much less those who have lower incomes, have other sorts of past issues that can just make it even more difficult, because landlords can't afford to be picky, and they are. They're often looking at a number of people at any given time, and as they want to protect their assets, trying to make sure that the person who appears to be the most stable and successful is the one who's going to get the housing. So definitely a need for our advocates to pitch in there and do a lot of great work with survivors and landlords. If there is the disclosure of an abusive background, sometimes landlords may be sympathetic, but then there are also many landlords who will very clearly state that they fear harm to their property and that there could be a threat to the neighbors if an abusive partner should show up. Just thinking also about issues related to discrimination. Many housing providers look at people and based on their first impressions will certainly again discriminate, much as we hate to state that that still goes on. But the impact of trauma, and I'm sure that many of you are becoming more and more familiar of how that presents in survivors, how it presents in people who have been traumatized, but sometimes they don't come across as the most stable, reliable individuals. Certainly the children that goes with parents may display trauma-related behavior, and for all of us who have small children or have had small children, we know that we can't always rely on them being perfectly behaved as we're looking at different housing units. And discrimination still exists based on race, ethnicity, national identity, or religion. Sometimes issues pop up in background checks. The lack of credit history, bad credit history, outstanding debt can be a killer. The lack of poor rental history. And if there's an eviction on the record, that also is another excuse for a landlord to just say no, not even going to try it. a lack of any sort of employment history, and for those of you who are trying to do a housing first approach with rapid rehousing and trying to find units, if people are not employed, we don't want that to be a barrier, but it certainly can be if someone is trying to access housing not to have a job at that point in time. Source of income, landlords will certainly discriminate based on the source of income, including housing vouchers. Criminal history, even that related to the abuse, will pop up and certainly be a detriment. Pets can be barriers, and of course so many survivors need and want their pets, even therapy animals, and it's illegal in most states, but landlords will say or put up high sorts of barriers for that therapy animal to be present with that survivor, and often there are increased damage deposits that may be way too high for anybody to afford. So when we think also of barriers in domestic violence, victim-specific housing, DVHTAC, shelter and transitional housing programs, those can be challenging for survivors too. As hard as we work to try to make sure they are welcoming and accessible, there are times when survivors may not feel safe in the programs. They may feel marginalized. Even as we talk about safety and confidentiality in the programs, there can be the issues related to removal from a survivor community that can impact their ability to stay connected with the important support people in their lives. Program eligibility requirements can create barriers for survivors. So many times in our communal living programs, we really feel a need for people to be clean and sober, and sometimes put up eligibility requirements related to that. There are other sorts of eligibility requirements that still exist, like contact with an abusive partner, and I'm sure you can think of many other issues that do create barriers. And finally, the limited funding for victim-specific housing, and it appears to be decreasing as we watch just how funding across our country is going. And when it's that limited and we're all at or over capacity, there just isn't enough anyway to meet the need. So now I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne.
Thanks, Linda. So Linda discussed the barriers to accessing housing, and survivors also face barriers maintaining safe housing for reasons that are a direct result of the violence that they've experienced or continue to experience. So often or sometimes landlords, not often, but sometimes landlords evict survivors because of the number of times they are calling 911 or the damage that's being done to the apartment as a result of the abuse. And there's a proliferation of nuisance laws. These are crime-free ordinances that penalize landlords and tenants when the police are perceived to be called too many times to the premises. And while the ACLU and other advocates are fighting these laws across the country, too often survivors are being hurt by them and continue to lose their safe housing as a result of the abuse. Survivors also have a hard time maintaining housing as an ongoing impact of their violence and victimization. So for example, stalking and the threat of violence can force survivors to frequently relocate. And as Linda had talked about, various barriers to accessing shelter programs, often once shelter is maintained or survivors are able to access shelter, they're then asked to leave if their abuser has identified where they're staying, if the shelter providers see that the confidentiality has been compromised. And so that can be a challenge for many survivors who've finally been able to access safe housing and then must leave as a result of their abuser's behavior. And isolation is an issue too. As a result of the abuse,
Isolation from community, friends, and family can erode a survivor's safety net, which includes their social networks. And so that unexpected challenges that we all face from time to time, a blip in childcare, medical emergencies, car repairs, these all can quickly result in losing housing or a housing crisis. And as Kris had explained earlier, economic abuse impacts, the impact of economic abuse continues often long after the abuse has ceased. So batterers commonly use violence or threats of violence and intimidation to keep survivors from working and keeping employment. And so having access to the family funds can be hard they've been sort of cut off from that access. And so even if the abuser has left, it's often hard for the survivor to maintain the rent and maintain steady employment due to the abuse. And so I turn it up now over to Larisa, who'll talk about how the domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy response or advocate response to these barriers to accessing and maintaining housing has evolved over the years, such that there are now, models and ways and interventions to help survivors gain safe housing.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. So first, let me just say that we could have an entire webinar dedicated to this one slide, which is the battered women's shelter movement. And I'm only going to take a minute or so to talk about it. And actually, maybe the note is we should do an entire webinar dedicated to this. But what I want to highlight for those of you who may not know is that this did not come out of nowhere. We did not make it today to talk about safe housing out of nowhere. We didn't come here today to talk about VAWA out of nowhere. There was a movement in the 70s, and even before then, that was starting. The women's movement was starting, or the second wave of the women's movement, and a real push to focus on violence against women. And one of the main issues was that we really wanted to come out from hiding. We wanted to air that dirty laundry. We wanted to make sure that survivors had safe place to be. And one of the main focuses there when the movement started really was around criminal and civil justice response. And during that time, there really had been no legal protections in place, and certainly no federal legal protections in place, or very few, that focused on violence against women. And so what we ended up advocating for, something that most of you are very familiar with, and that's the Violence Against Women Act. There are also other federal, state, and local protections that come in place here. But what's really important to just highlight here in terms of the focus on history and the movement and the Violence Against Women Act is that the funding to battered women's shelters is directly connected to all of the efforts that came from the people who were involved in the movement many years ago. And we still continue, as all of you know, to fight for funding to make sure that there are safe places for survivors and to make sure that survivors' protections, legal protections are in place. So I'm going to just do an overview here, highlights of the Violence Against Women Act, specifically how they apply in the context of housing. So the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in 2013. And essentially, under VAWA, someone who's a survivor of domestic violence or other areas, categories as well that I'll mention in a moment, and a tenant in federal public housing, Section 8 voucher or project-based housing, or in a program that receives McKinney-Vento funds. That's funding for homeless shelters and housing programs, which includes the Continuum of Care, has rights. And I'm about to highlight some of what those rights are. So first off, and importantly, VAWA applies to survivors regardless of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. It provides protections for survivors not just of domestic violence, but also of dating violence, sexual assault, stalking. And it also applies to someone who's affiliated with the survivor. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because I don't have the time to do it, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that either later in this webinar or feel free to contact me about that. So let's look at some of the protections. What are the rights? So survivors have the right to be accepted into shelter or housing programs, okay? So they don't have, you cannot deny access to someone who's a survivor of domestic violence because they're a domestic violence victim. So for example, a housing provider cannot deny an applicant access to housing if they find out that this person is a survivor, if the survivor discloses that they're a survivor. When I say if they find out if they're a survivor, what I mean is that if there's, let's say, another program participant who knows that that person is a survivor and may have experienced domestic violence, and he mentions it to his case manager, and somehow that ends up connecting to the access to shelter for that survivor, and that person is then denied shelter. This is an issue that we've touched upon throughout this webinar so far, and is an issue that we see around the country. Oftentimes what we'll hear is, well, there's a policy in place, or there might be a policy, or there's another program that's better suited for that person. And the reality is that there's often not a policy in place. And if there is a policy in place, as I've been talking about the Violence Against Women Act, most likely that policy is unlawful. No policy can deny access to survivors of shelter or other types of housing. Okay, so I'm going to move on a little bit here. Survivors have the right to remove the batterer from public housing lease or Section 8 housing choice voucher. They have the right to stay in the unit themselves. Survivors have the right to ensure that the housing authority and Section 8 landlords honor civil protection orders, specifically if it mentions or actually specifies something to do with housing and whether the batterer needs to be removed or at a distance from contact with the survivor. Survivors have the right to court, which means they have the right to move to another location. If the survivor has a Section 8 voucher, so long as it's within the housing authority's jurisdiction. And survivors have the right to ask for an emergency transfer. Survivors have the right to stay in the unit, even if there is or has been criminal activity that is directly related to the domestic violence. And last but not least, survivors have a right to confidentiality of information. So information specific to the survivor's status as a domestic violence victim should not be shared or relayed to a third party. And if that is the case or that needs to happen, the only person that can provide that yes or no is the survivor. It should be in writing, and there should be a time-limited consent form. I'm happy to talk more about that. I think many of you are aware of that or understand what that is, but I'm happy to talk more after this webinar about that, what it looks like, and what programs should have in place. All right, so other protections, other federal protections include the Fair Housing Act, Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. I'm not going to go into those, just know that there are protections there as well for survivors. Last but not least, there are also local and state housing protections. Many jurisdictions have additional housing protections for survivors that go beyond VAWA. And when I say that, what I'm saying is they often apply to private landlords, okay? So survivors often have the right to have eviction protection, or early lease relief. Some states or localities have a 14-day period of time. So the survivor notifies her landlord that she is experiencing or has experienced domestic violence, that she should be able, or he should be released from the lease within 14 days without any additional penalties. Survivors have the right to also get their locks changed, reasonable accommodations, and a couple of other areas as well. These are local and state housing protections that often apply to private landlords, so they go beyond the Violence Against Women Act. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Kris Billhardt. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thanks, Larisa, so much. And now, in addition to knowing about the laws that provide housing protections, how else can we lower the barriers that survivors may face? Well, this is a big one. Making a shift as a field, I'm talking about the victim services field. In this case, we started out really focused on what makes a lot of sense, the crisis, the emergency, the need to provide protection, and sometimes hiding people so that the abuser has no more access to them. So we really have focused on emergency shelter and kind of temporary housing, transitional housing, as a huge, important, groundbreaking, revolutionary service that didn't used to exist. But we have, as a field, had to start looking at whether we've continued to expand our look at what survivors need around housing. And we know that many, as we were saying earlier, folks who are in shelter or transitional housing, if they don't have a permanent housing option when they leave, are stuck with some of the same choices that they may have had previous to entering the program. So we're, as a field, paying a lot of attention to safe housing upon exit from those traditional shelter and transitional housing services. And as we do that, we're really having to focus on longer-term needs that survivors have. And many of them, as we've talked about, really do intersect with their ability to attain that permanent housing that we're talking about, return to their safe housing if it can be safe for them to return, and then maintain and stabilize in that housing. And we know that we have to rely on the homeless housing system as partners and as collaborators in this look, because we don't often have access to the funding streams. We may not have the housing options beyond what we've had in place for some time. So what we can do is bring all the expertise that we've built as a movement and that survivor-focused lens into the housing arena. So in addition to trying to help folks, in the course of trying to help folks get into safe housing, there are all those legal protections that Larisa was talking about, and it becomes part of our advocacy to do advocacy for survivors around those protections. This also moves us into more direct contact with landlords and housing providers about those laws and protections. That's a form of advocacy that we are stepping into in big ways around the country. As well, educating survivors about what their housing rights are and coaching them to have those conversations and to know what's unacceptable under the law so that they know the basis of a fight if they want to engage with a system or a provider about exercising their rights. I shouldn't say fight, I should say engagement. But sometimes it is a tussle. And then the issue we've referred to a couple of times today in the webinar, maybe survivors should get to remain in their own homes if that's a choice that they want to make and they want to try not to disrupt the children or to make the disruption and displacement a just very short-term temporary displacement and return to the home that they left. There are tools that we can use to lower barriers to their being able to do that successfully. One of them is flexible funding that can pay for things that allow them to get on their feet more financially for a period of time as they're coping with all the aftermath of the abuse. And then another real barrier lowerer is mobile advocacy, where instead of asking survivors to come to our offices and our locations, we go to them and provide services in areas or parts of town that are safe and comfortable for them to have us visit them in. And we're all about remembering that survivors need a whole continuum of housing options. We want them to have long-term permanent options. We want them to have short-term temporary options. And the point is that we are focusing on those housing options with that domestic and sexual violence lens and making sure that they do have access to them safely and can rebuild and enact their plans from those places. And enhancing safety also means reaching across, as we're saying, into the homeless housing system and working together in partnership. And this is really a two-way partnership. We need each other. The homeless housing system needs the expertise and the skill sets that domestic and sexual violence advocates can bring to bear to help them understand how to work effectively. The domestic and sexual violence field certainly needs to know more about what the housing options are, how they get accessed, and so forth. The point here is that survivors should be able to have choices to access the housing options of both of those systems, and coordinating back and forth between those systems is really important. Survivors who may be getting housing needs met through the homeless housing system will still need to have the option of connecting with the supportive services that the domestic and sexual violence system may be able to bring. We also, in lowering barriers, are in many communities around the country taking a very serious look at how we can create confidentiality for survivors in the homeless information management systems, the HMIS systems that HUD requires COCs to use. We're strong advocates of providing survivors with the option to opt in once they have information about what data is collected, where it's stored, who it's shared with, for survivors to be able to make an informed decision about whether they want to opt into that process, rather than just assuming that because they're enrolling in services that they're opting into those, or that they have to say on their own, I don't want to do that. So offering them the choice and being proactive about it is key. It's also important in this partnership for the homeless housing system to become familiar with what victim services providers can and can't provide in the way of information and disclosures, the personally identifying information that victim services programs may have about survivors that the systems may be working with together. So when survivors are receiving services from both systems, within both systems, there's a sense sometimes on the homeless housing side that the domestic
it seems as though we've lost Kris.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like we lost audio for Kris.
Mm-hmm.
Brittany, do you want to go ahead and jump in here?
Sure, I will.
Great.
Pick up where Kris left off.
Wonderful.
So
thanks, Brittany.
I'm going to do it off the cuff, so I certainly can't fill her shoes. But Kris, if you get back on, feel free to interrupt me. So as we're looking at opportunities for the homeless service system to be more informed about the needs and opportunities to serve survivors, it's important that COCs understand that DV providers are using comparable databases in order to capture that data and protect that personally identifying information. It's also critical that we have these partnerships so that domestic violence and sexual assault experts have this space to determine household needs and consider the safety and privacy that is afforded in the DVSA space that may not be as readily available and protective in the homeless services space. So recognizing in the space of homeless service partnerships and with domestic violence service partners that those DV service providers play a really critical role in ensuring safety and privacy is protected of the survivors that are being served by both systems. So again, those partnerships would be focused, or should be focused, on making accessible the full range of housing resources and tools that the homeless service system has at its disposal, making those resources available to DV and SA systems and programs. There's also a critical component of these partnerships where DV and SA programs should be able to provide input on how the homeless service system is working for survivors. So if we look at opportunities at the local level for COC leaders and DV providers to be really collaborating to think about how the homeless service system can be improved in order to better serve survivors. And I'll get into some of those opportunities here shortly. I want to take it up a level to that the systemic view of what these partnerships can look like. So to bring it all the way up to the federal level, there's federal funding across HHS, DOJ, and HUD for housing programs that are specifically targeted to individuals and families fleeing domestic violence. So unlike DOJ and HHS programs, that's OVW and FIPSA, HUD funding is channeled through those regional planning bodies that coordinate the local homeless service system. We've been talking about COCs, and I think we have a few on here today. So it's important to understand that HUD funding is allocated through the local COCs through an annual program competition. Now, as we start to understand the opportunities for partnership at that local level, it's important to understand that HUD uses their annual Notice of Funding Availability, the NOFA, for the COC competition to really incentivize and encourage partnership, as well as other best practices as they relate to implementing homeless service programs. So when we talk a lot about looking at the NOFA and what's in the NOFA, often we're looking for those leverage points to incentivize partnership and best practices at the local level. So over the last several years, HUD has been refining the NOFA to do more and more of that. While this is a very heavy lift because we're shifting very large systems, it takes a bit of time, but it is something that HUD has been trying to do aggressively for the last several years, and we see that progressively in each NOFA. So as we look at those opportunities to enhance partnerships at the local level, we were talking earlier about what it would look like to build a shared understanding and a two-way partnership to ensure that in communities, survivors have access to choices, to housing options that are available both through the homeless service system and through services only provided by DV service providers. So what does that look like? How can we actually put that into action at the local level? We've brainstormed a few ideas here, but we're looking forward to some of your questions. Hopefully we can dig into this further, and there will also be more resources from the TA Consortium over the next several months. But some ideas that we've come up with about how those partnerships can be strengthened at the local level are exploring opportunities for cross-training. Are COCs and homeless service providers looking for training on safety planning? Are DV providers trying to strengthen their practices around connections to permanent housing, maybe doing some cross-training around housing navigators? Those types of interactions will really help strengthen your system to collaborate better. It's as simple as sharing, really, will help build your partnership. But then if you also want to look at best practices, we want to look at how can we inform each other's intake and assessment practices? How can we share information about coordinated entry and how we can align our systems? Other questions to kick around and consider when building partnerships between COCs and homeless service providers and DV service providers are to start with building a shared understanding of each other's goals and metrics. We know, as we've discussed today, that homeless service providers look at success differently than DV service providers do. For homeless service providers, it's about connections to permanent housing, whereas domestic violence service providers, as we know, are looking to ensure survivor safety is the primary and foremost goal or focus. So how do we build partnerships that recognize those different goals and metrics in order to navigate ways to work together? And of course, as we've alluded to, we need to have real clear understandings on data sharing limitations. And these are just a few, as I've mentioned, of the ways that we as federal partners would like to encourage you all to be partnering across different sectors at the local level. The Domestic Violence Housing TA Consortium will be putting out more resources on this topic over the next several months, as well as your federal partners. So I hope this laid the groundwork for some of those ideas. I'm going to turn it back over to Suzanne to help us wrap up.
Sure. And before I want to stay on the slide for just one quick second to mention another promising practice that we're excited to see, which is communities developing task forces or coalitions specifically on this intersection of domestic violence and housing and homelessness. So that's something else that we're looking at more closely as communities are beginning to use that shared coalition task force model to address the overlap in their own communities. So just wanted to let folks know that if you have any additional questions or would like more training or technical assistance, to please reach out. Here is some of our sort of general technical assistance requests to Nash. Larisa Kofman, this is her information. She's the director of Nash. And Kris, who I'm sorry that we lost, but she's a great asset and has great expertise in this area. So here is our contact information, as well as me, Suzanne. I work with Dash and Nash, and have experience with a lot of the local projects and safe housing models that we discussed, and Linda Olson with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and she's the guru of DV Housing First in particular, and then Britt Monzo from USICH. So this is our resource and contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out for any additional information. And with that, I pass it over to Peg.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a little time for some questions. I've picked up a few from the chat box as the presentation has gone on. And while I know there's been a little bit of discussion going on in the chat box, I thought there might be folks who would be interested in hearing the questions and the answers. So Catherine Huang had posted a question about whether VAWA also protects survivors from having to require a TPO or CPO to get accepted into a housing placement. Does someone want to field that?
Well, this is Kris, and I am back on the call. Can you hear me?
Yay!
Yay! So I would leave the legal aspect of that question to Larisa to chime in on, but I can tell you that it's a best practice to not require survivors to obtain a protection order, certainly as a condition of being in the program or being in the housing unit. Or even as just an expectation, even if it's not tied to housing. That's a very individualized decision. And survivors have to be trusted to make the best choice about whether that's going to actually create safety or perhaps imperil them in new ways as the system comes into the life of the abuser and perhaps further abuse or just being incensed by the survivor taking this step comes into that abuser's life. So we really recommend against, it's not a best practice to require a protection order when someone enters services. And Liz, are you back on the call? Can handle the legal aspect?
Yeah, sorry about that. I just got bumped off and I got put right back in. So Kris, thank you so much for fielding that. Yes, not only is it a best practice, but it's not lawful. There shouldn't be any additional requirements for someone who's a domestic violence survivor to access legal protection. So if there's a requirement or someone says, oh, I need a protection order for X, Y, or Z to happen for the survivor, then that's not necessarily lawful. So if that is something that's in place, or if someone thinks that's in place, feel free to reach out to me for some additional information, thoughts, or guidance. It's usually something that has occurred by mistake or in passing, or maybe even through sort of hearsay as a practice within, as a practice amongst housing providers. So it is not necessarily not just a best practice, but it's not a requirement for survivors, especially under the Violence Against Women Act, to access any of their protections that they're afforded.
Great. Thank you. Before that question from Catherine, we got a question from Katie about whether rapid rehousing programs fall under VAWA. Does someone want to field that?
You want me to? Yeah,
go for it.
I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to see if we can go back to the slide. The short answer is yes, to the extent that they are covered by, it's so much easier to get the slide up. So here we go. VAWA covers, covers public housing, Section 8 vouchers, project-based housing, or a program that receives funds through McKinney-Vento. That includes homeless shelters, housing programs. One of the questions in the chat box had to do with emergency shelters. The shelter receives funding through the McKinney-Vento, which also includes Continuum of Care as part of the COC. They are under VAWA. That means the protections afforded to survivors are extended. That's the sort of short answer there in terms of whether rapid housing programs are covered. So yes, they most likely are covered.
So Kathleen has just raised an interesting question. She says, I get requiring a protection order as a barrier and potentially not legal, but can you offer suggestions to landlords on how to put protections in place that allow them to have abusers removed from the unit? And she's referring specifically of private landlords.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, yes. Right. Something that we recommend just recommend as a best practice is that we want survivors to be able to self-certify, right? So we don't want to ask for additional documentation, especially something like a protection order. Not all survivors want to get a protection order. Protection orders, there might be some additional issues in terms of accessing a protection order or getting a protection order. So we don't want that to be the sole way to be able to have survivors access some rights when it comes to housing, especially with private landlords. So self-certification is ideal. Some jurisdictions, especially those that have state or local protections, that also want some kinds of documentation that's not just self-certification, include an array of options. So it could be an advocate letter. It could be a police report. It could be a mental health professional letter, something in writing stating that this is a survivor of domestic violence. So, and content-wise, something being very limited, just stating the name of the survivor that individual has experienced domestic violence, possibly including the name of the perpetrator, and leaving it at that, and that being documentation enough. Some jurisdictions, especially when it comes to private landlords, will provide that option, so documentation from an advocate, mental health provider, law enforcement, or self-certification, obviously, or also a protection order, but as an array of options. So protection order not being the only option. Obviously, again, I just want to highlight as a best practice, we highly recommend that survivors are able to self-certify, but we understand that that is not always the case, and that sometimes there's some significant resistance. For those of you, this question is coming from a place where there are no local or state protections, so there's, it's really just you all working with private landlords and trying to navigate this. That's something that we're happy to provide some technical assistance on. Even if, you don't do policy work, you're not in a place, and there's maybe not a political climate to work on legislation, we're happy to provide technical assistance and support to you all to work with private landlords to really make sure survivors are safe.
Great. I'm going back up to, we've had a few questions about how to provide protections for survivors in public housing. So Bettina had asked if a victim could lose her housing if she has an abuser living with her who is not on the lease but wants him removed. And she's speaking specifically about public housing.
Right. Yes. So I saw that in the chat, and Bettina, thanks for the clarification. It is public housing, not private. The survivor has a couple of different rights here, especially if the perpetrator, the batterer, is not on the lease. She does have the right to have the batterer removed from the housing that she is in. She has the right to ask for an emergency transfer, seek an emergency transfer as well. That's one of the most common things, depending on her situation, especially if she decides that it's not safe for her to be where she is. That's the sort of short answer. I have a whole bunch of additional questions around that could sort of help me guide, but that's the short answer, trying to sort of cover a couple of different ways that this comes up.
Okay. So there was a following question from Ariana that asked, can a public housing authority require, after an emergency transfer or lease bifurcation, as a condition of the family's continued occupancy, the head of household must certify that the culpable household member has vacated the unit and will not be permitted to visit or stay as a guest in the assisted unit. The family must present evidence of the former household member's current address upon the PHA's request.
Wow.
That's a long one, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a long one. I want to know where you live. I'm really curious about the jurisdiction where that's coming from. I actually, I'm not gonna take time right now to fully respond to it because I think it's complicated. But what I will say is that most likely no. But I would want to take that one offline, I think. Yeah, I want to take that one offline. So you can just contact me directly at Kofman@dc.org or put it in through the evaluation as a TA request. I'm happy to chat with you further about it.
Great. So Michelle had a question. Let's say that a victim has project-based Section 8. It seems like VAWA would allow for an emergency transfer, but how does it work, especially if the property owner has no other property?
Okay, good question. So there's a way to be able to move to another property as well. I think this is something where we really need a significant amount of, or a good amount of advocacy on the ground in terms of working with landlords and educating them about the needs of survivors and the protections that are out there. So even if there is no other property and it's section-based housing, the survivor still has rights. I think most closely the best way to sort of navigate that is to make sure that the survivor is working with a local domestic violence program and being provided with some other options there as well in terms of other possibilities if they exist in the community. So the answer is hard to say, yes, we're definitely going to be able to find the survivor another place to live, but the option is definitely out there even if that's the only property that the landlord has.
Great. Do any of our other presenters have additional thoughts that they'd like to offer around these questions?
Well, this is Kris, and I just want to say, based on the questions themselves, it sounds to me, and I know the group was largely comprised of victim services programs, you all are really on the ground with these issues. You really are out there trying to do systems navigation and working with providers, homeless services providers, as well as with landlords. And I just want to say kudos to you. You're out there doing the work. Thank you.
And this is Suzanne, and I would just say this presentation is really to sort of a scan of all the topics and issues connected at the intersection. And our hope moving forward is that we've developed webinars and toolkits on specific sections that do sort of a deeper dive on these topics. So we'll be able to, for example, Larisa and Nash will be presenting a webinar specifically on the protections, both federal and local protections that communities can use to help survivors, and we'll be providing resources on all the topics that we've discussed on what this webinar is pretty much a survey or a scan of the issues at the intersection.
And can I just add, this is Larisa. There's a fantastic resource that I'm going to send out as well, since we've been getting a lot of ballot questions. It's a brochure FAQ that the National Housing Law Project developed, and it's fantastic. It gets to not the more complicated questions, but it's a great sort of handy little brochure to have around if you just have a basic question and are just wondering, who does DAWA apply to? Something like that. It's a great brochure. So I'm going to make sure to include that link when I send out the evaluation as well.
Great. And I wanted to just reiterate a point that Chrissy Davis from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence made in the chat. The NRCDV is also part of the DV and Housing TA Consortium team. And she wanted to remind everyone to be sure to visit the Safe Housing Partnerships website for resources that address all of these and more issues around the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and housing and homelessness. And there is an opportunity on that website to pose questions if you have additional questions, as well as to request technical assistance and training. So as we mentioned at the top of the presentation, you can go to safehousingpartnerships.org for more information, as well as to find additional resources and tools there. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, I think that will wrap up our presentation if there are no other pressing questions. I really want to thank everyone again for joining today's session. Please be sure to respond to our brief survey after you log out to provide your feedback about the session. And if you're interested in technical assistance or training on any of the topics or issues that we've discussed today, you'll have the opportunity to request it directly when you complete the survey. Also, please feel free to contact any of the participants. And our contact information of the presenters is also part of the slides. We will be sending out the PowerPoint slides at the end of this session. And I did have someone ask about the slides from Monday's session, and that will be available to everyone soon. So we will make sure that those PowerPoints are sent out. And we really look forward to getting your training and TA requests and continuing this conversation. We're really happy that everyone is so interested in learning and doing more around this intersection. It's something that we obviously feel very strongly about. So thank you, everyone, for your interest and support. And we'll talk with you all soon.